Anxiety disorders, or what we've come to label as neurotic conditions, are so widespread in the modern world that many suggest we've entered an age of fear. Walk down any city street and you'll see it. The woman gripping her phone like a lifeline. The man whose jaw is clenched so tight you can see it from across the room. The countless others moving through their days like ghosts in their own lives. But what's really causing so many people to succumb to this pathological anxiety? The psychologist Carl Jung dedicated decades of his life trying to answer this question. Jung's theory of neurosis, however, is largely neglected in our modern era, where medication is viewed as the definitive solution for virtually all mental suffering. We've become a society that treats symptoms, that manages discomfort, that medicates away the very signals our psyche is desperately trying to send us. But Jung's approach demands our attention for a specific reason. Unlike the pharmaceutical model, which focuses on suppression, Jung understood the neurotic illness as a compass of the psyche, pointing us toward necessary change in our way of life. Think about that for a moment. What if your anxiety isn't a malfunction? What if it's a message? And if we simply ignore this compass and continue with life as usual, we lose our vital orientation, depriving ourselves of the crucial navigation that neurotic symptoms provide. This brings us to Andrew. One night at 3 a.m., he sat in front of his bathroom mirror, unable to sleep. His reflection stared back, but the eyes looking at him felt like a stranger's. The fluorescent light hummed above, casting harsh shadows across his face. He'd been awake for 2 hours, his mind racing through the same loops it always did. The presentation at work, the conversation he'd avoided, the life he wasn't living. He whispered to himself, "I'm tired of hiding from myself." This is the moment many of us live through alone, in the dead of night when the masks finally fall away and we glimpse the person we've abandoned. It's the moment when all the strategies stop working, when all the distractions fail, and we're left with the brutal truth of our own existence. But Andrew's suffering held a secret, one that Carl Jung spent his entire career uncovering, and one that would change everything Andrew thought he knew about his own mind. Chapter 1. The compass you've been ignoring. A defining characteristic of Jung's theory is that the root of neurosis is always to be found in the present day, in our current mode of living, not in our personal history. Now, Jung wasn't denying that our neurotic suffering may have originated in our childhood, nor was he overlooking the profound influence our formative years have on our psychological development. Rather, he focused on the present because he believed that what generated the symptoms of neurosis was a conflicted way of life in the here and now. Yes, conflicts may have existed in our past, but those conflicts have evolved. They are no longer the source of our present suffering. This insight would have been revelatory for someone like Andrew. You see, he had spent 3 years in therapy, excavating childhood memories, reliving every painful moment with his distant father, understanding every pattern, analyzing every dream. Yet the anxiety remained. He would lie awake at night, chest tight, thoughts racing, wondering why all that understanding hadn't set him free. Jung would say to Andrew, "You're looking in the wrong place." But if the past wasn't the problem, what was? What invisible force was keeping Andrew trapped in his own private hell? The answer lies in what Jung called the tasks of life. March, Chapter 2. The tasks you're refusing to face. What is the nature of the conflict that leads to neurosis? In his work on the psychology of neurosis, Jung references a profound insight from the pre-Socratic philosopher Heraclitus, which helps unravel this mystery. Character is destiny. In other words, your attitude, the fundamental posture you take toward life's demands, shapes the contours of your suffering. Each of us is presented with a series of evolutionary tasks, which are not of our choosing, and so can be understood as our fate. These tasks emerge from our biological inheritance, our social nature, and the culture in which we exist. Foremost among these is our drive toward genetic propagation. But others include the need to achieve psychological autonomy from our parents, to cultivate meaningful social bonds, to contribute something of value to our community, to discover a sense of purpose, and eventually to accept our finitude. Here's where Andrew's story becomes painfully clear. He knew, deep in his bones, that he needed to leave his soul-crushing consulting job to pursue music, the thing that actually made him feel alive. Every morning he put on his corporate armor, the crisp white shirt, the navy suit, the leather shoes that clicked against marble floors with a sound that felt like a countdown to his own extinction. He walked into the glass tower, rode the elevator to the 23rd floor, and felt something inside him die a little more. He told himself it was about being responsible, about security, about being realistic. His parents had struggled financially, and he'd sworn he'd never live that way. But somewhere along the line, financial security became a prison more confining than poverty ever was. His guitar sat in the corner of his apartment, gathering dust, while he generated reports nobody would remember and attended meetings that solved nothing. But Jung would recognize this. Andrew wasn't being responsible. He was committing what Jung called a partial suicide. As Jung wrote, "The perpetual hesitation of the neurotic to step into life is easily explained by his desire to remain isolated so as not to get involved in the risky fight for existence. But anyone who refuses to experience life must repress his desire to live. In other words, he must commit a partial suicide." This wasn't metaphor, it was diagnosis, and this diagnosis reveals the central battlefield of the human psyche. Jung saw that we are fundamentally torn. On one side, we possess a natural impulse to accomplish these tasks. Our instincts, our nature as social beings, the pull of cultural conformity, and our approaching death all propel us in this direction. But while we are naturally driven toward these tasks, we also harbor a profound psychic resistance, a tendency toward inertia and self-sabotage. And according to Jung, the outcome of this internal battle is not guaranteed. It determines the entire trajectory of our psychological life. If we can overcome our cowardice and laziness and display the courage to face up to the tasks of life, then these tasks act as guides, marking the path toward healthy development. But if our fear and inertia get the upper hand, and we neglect the tasks of life, then they become chains around our neck. The neurotic individual, according to Jung, is the man or woman who walks among the unwilling, who has adopted an inadequate posture toward the tasks of life. When treating his patients, Jung emphasized that the problem for the neurotic always lies with their attitude, the accomplishment of the tasks being of secondary importance. This played out in Andrew's daily life in subtle but devastating ways. He would sit at dinner with friends, surrounded by conversation and laughter, yet feeling completely alone. He was there physically, nodding at the right moments, smiling when expected, responding on autopilot. But his mind was elsewhere, trapped in a loop of what-ifs and should-haves. Someone would ask him a question. "Andrew, what do you think?" And he wouldn't hear it. The table would go quiet, all eyes on him, and he'd have to ask them to repeat it. This happened constantly. His friends started to notice. "You okay, man?" they'd ask. "Yeah, just tired," he'd say. But it wasn't exhaustion. He wasn't absent because of work stress or burnout. He was absent because he'd been avoiding the real conversation, the real connection, the real vulnerability that authentic presence demands. It's easier to be a ghost than to risk being seen. Easier to float above your own life than to actually live it. Now, Jung acknowledged that life can present us with formidable obstacles which make it impossible to achieve a certain task. But this does not condemn us to neurotic suffering. In such cases, acceptance of the situation and a redirection of our energy to another of life's tasks is the appropriate response. But usually, the impediments we face are not insurmountable. Rather, what holds us back is a moral incapacity. We are either too lazy or we lack the courage to face up to the challenge. Being impeded in this manner is not unique to the neurotic, as we all face times where our resolve is tested. But what is unique to the neurotic is that rather than acknowledge this inadequacy, they choose to deny responsibility and externalize their failure, blaming circumstances alone for their paralysis. And Andrew had his ready-made answers. It's the economy. It's my anxiety disorder. It's my father. It's the way the world is. While these contained fragments of truth, they became shields behind which he hid from the one truth that terrified him most. I am choosing this. Every day, I am choosing this prison. And that choice, that daily act of self-betrayal, was about to reveal itself in the most unexpected way. Chapter 3. Where your energy actually goes. In such a conflicted state, our desire to accomplish the tasks of life and all the vital energy which propels us in this direction does not simply vanish. Rather, it seeks an alternative outlet. In other words, when we cease moving forward in life, we tend to regress to more immature, or what Jung called primitive, modes of adaptation. And this regression in response to the conflict is what generates the various symptoms of neurosis. The energy doesn't disappear. It can't. It's like water held behind a dam. The pressure builds and builds until it finds any crack, any weakness to pour through. And those cracks? For Andrew, they were his symptoms, be it the diffuse anxiety that colored every moment of his day, the irrational fears that kept him from living fully, the compulsive rituals he performed to feel safe, the existential emptiness that hollowed him out, the apathy that made everything feel pointless, or the intrusive thoughts that invaded his mind unbidden. All of these were manifestations of the same misdirected energy. Take Andrew, for example. He and his girlfriend barely talked, an abyss of silence growing between them. The real task was to sit down and have the most difficult conversation of their lives about the future of the relationship. Instead, Andrew declared war on the way she loaded the dishwasher. He would spend the day irritated, waiting to see if she would put the glasses in the wrong place. He'd rearrange the plates, complain out loud, turning a mundane act into a battlefield. His rational mind knew the dishes were irrelevant, but his neurotic side needed this conflict. Why? Because a fight about dishes is concrete. It has rules, a right and a wrong. It was a battle he felt he could win. The conversation about the death of the relationship, however, was a mapless territory of pain and vulnerability. The energy he should have been using to save his relationship was spent on a futile war of domestic logistics. After all, it's much easier to fix a kitchen than a relationship. But as uncomfortable as such symptoms may be, they serve a vital function. They alert us to the fact that we are descending a dangerous path. Because while we stagnate psychologically, our physical maturation does not cease. Time marches on, indifferent to our internal paralysis. And here's the cruel mirror life held up to Andrew. One morning, while shaving, he stopped and really looked at himself. The lines deepening around his eyes, lines that hadn't been there 2 years ago. The grey appearing at his temples, spreading like frost. His father had gone grey early too. His body was aging, marching forward with the inexorable rhythm of time, while his soul stayed frozen in place, stuck at some earlier version of himself. The Andrew who still had potential, who was still figuring things out, who hadn't yet made his choice. But he had made his choice. Every day he made it. The choice to stay safe, to stay small, to stay hidden. And that temporal desynchronization, that gap between who he was chronologically, a 34-year-old man, and who he was psychologically, still a boy waiting for permission to live, became unbearable to witness in the mirror's merciless reflection. The longer we exist in this conflicted state, the more maladapted we feel, and a vicious cycle takes hold. The symptoms worsen, which makes us avoid more, which intensifies the conflict, which amplifies the symptoms. Round and round, tighter and tighter, until we can barely breathe. When caught in the grip of neurosis, we are likely to wonder why we were cursed in this manner. What led us to react to life's challenges in this inadequate way? Jung did not identify a single cause for this incapacity. Rather, he recognized that each case is unique. For some of us, it can be traced to our biological predisposition. In other cases, it is our formative environment. But for most people, It is an inexplicable entanglement of genetic and environmental influences which is ultimately to blame. And perhaps that's the hardest truth Andrew had to face. There was no villain in his story, no single cause to identify and eliminate, no one thing to fix that would make it all make sense. He was born with a nervous system that ran a bit hot, predisposed to anxiety. He was raised by a distant father who taught him through absence that needs are weaknesses and that safety lies in self-sufficiency. He was shaped by a culture that values productivity over presence, achievement over authenticity. He was a product of biology, biography, and society. An inexplicable entanglement of forces both within and beyond his control. And here he was. Not because he was broken, but because he was human. Not because he'd failed, but because he'd never been taught that there was another way to be. The hardest truth wasn't that someone had hurt him. It was that no one had. His suffering had no antagonist, which meant it also had no easy resolution. It meant the work ahead would be his alone to do. But awareness of the problem was only the beginning. The question that haunted Andrew in those sleepless nights remained. What now? Because understanding the trap is one thing, but finding the courage to step out of it, that's where most people fail. Chapter 4. The honest assessment. The road to recovery, according to Jung, doesn't require reliving childhood memories or working through old family conflicts. Unless we were victims of trauma we've yet to process, our childhood memories won't free us from our present suffering. What we need is a new attitude, a fundamental shift in how we see ourselves and our situation. Andrew had to face a truth he'd been avoiding. He could no longer afford to falsify reality. No more blaming his anxiety disorder, his father, or the economy. No more pretending the consulting job was just temporary while he figured things out. Self-acceptance had to become the rule, not the exception. One evening, Andrew did something terrifying. He called Marcus, his oldest friend, the one person who'd known him since college, before the corporate armor, before the war over the dishes. "I need you to tell me the truth," Andrew said. "Who do you see when you look at me?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. Then, "I see someone brilliant who's afraid of his own light. I see my friend slowly disappearing." The words hit like a physical blow, but something in Andrew cracked open. For the first time in years, he wasn't hiding. Jung had suggested exactly this, turning to someone we trust for an honest assessment. Not for validation, but for the mirror we can't hold up ourselves. But seeing yourself clearly is only half the battle. Because once you know who you've become, you have to face where you're headed. And that future, if Andrew didn't change, was more terrifying than any past he'd been excavating. Chapter 5. The Raging Bull. Self-acceptance was crucial, but it was only the beginning. Andrew also had to recognize where he was heading if nothing changed, and that vision was darker than he'd admitted. He'd been telling himself that if he could just manage his symptoms, avoid the triggers, keep the anxiety at bay, then a comfortable life was still possible. Symptom management, not recovery, had become his primary goal. But Jung warned that this path leads to a hell of one's own making. A prison built brick by brick from our own avoidance. Andrew saw it clearly now. The avoidance had snowballed. First, he stopped playing music in public. Then he stopped playing at all. He avoided difficult conversations, then all deep conversations. He constructed a smaller and smaller world, believing he was keeping himself safe. But the walls were closing in, and what felt like protection was actually suffocation. Jung compared recovery to climbing a steep mountain pass. Those who never attempt it, he said, are like people sitting on a pleasant valley road, not realizing a raging bull is heading directly for them. Andrew could feel it now, that bull charging toward him. His youth, his potential, his life, all thundering past while he sat frozen, waiting for the perfect moment that would never come. The choice wasn't between comfort and difficulty. It was between one kind of suffering and another. And Andrew finally understood. Climbing the mountain would be hard, but being trampled in the valley would destroy him. Understanding this changed everything, but understanding alone wouldn't save him. Jung had one more demand, one that terrified Andrew more than anything else. Stop thinking and start doing. But do what, exactly? And how do you act when you don't even know what you're supposed to become? Chapter 6. The leap into action. The attitude change was crucial, but it was only preparatory. The real solution, Jung insisted, lies in action. We must stop being mere observers of life and venture into the strange world with all its unpredictable possibilities. Andrew wanted a roadmap. Tell me exactly what to do, his mind pleaded. But Jung cautioned against this. As he wrote, there is no universal prescription. Each person's path is unique, and what works for one might be meaningless for another. What Andrew needed was to ask himself a radical question, one Alfred Adler had recommended. If I were free of this neurosis, free of the fear of social ridicule, what would I choose to do? Who would I want to become? The answer came not from his rational mind, but from somewhere deeper. His dreams had been showing him all along. The recurring image of himself on stage, guitar in hand, voice raw and real, not performing for applause, but for the act itself, for the alignment of inner and outer life. So Andrew made a decision. He signed up for an open mic night at a small venue across town. No plan, no safety net. Just him, his guitar, and the terror of being seen. But making the decision and actually showing up are two very different things, because when the moment came, every cell in Andrew's body would scream at him to run. Chapter 7. Moving forward with fear. The night of the open mic, Andrew's anxiety surged the moment he walked into the venue. Heart racing, palms sweating, thoughts screaming at him to turn around. This is exactly what Jung predicted. As we begin the extroversion that accompanies recovery, focusing our energy on living in the world instead of in our heads, our symptoms will intensify before they improve. Many people never heed the call, Jung observed, maintaining that they must first conquer their symptoms before they can begin living. But this approach fails every time. If our symptoms are the result of standing on the sidelines, then we can't wait for them to disappear before stepping onto the field. That's the paradox. The cure requires us to act before we feel ready. Andrew understood now. Recovery would only be achieved if he was willing to move forward in the presence of fear and anxiety, not after they had vanished. He sat on the small stage, adjusted the microphone, and began to play. His voice cracked on the first note. His fingers fumbled, but he didn't stop. The song was imperfect, raw, achingly human, and for the first time in years, Andrew felt alive, truly alive, not just existing, but present in his own life. There's no formula for deliverance, Jung wrote, no advice that turns the meek into the brave. But there is this, the willingness to act despite the fear, to build a life not by eliminating anxiety, but by refusing to let it be the final word. The road continues. Andrew's recovery didn't happen that night. It wasn't a single moment of transformation, but rather a gradual unfolding. It happened in the days and weeks that followed, each small act of courage building on the last. Choosing connection over isolation. Choosing presence over escape. Choosing his authentic path over the comfortable prison. The neurosis, Jung believed, is only a curse if we remain forever caught in it. But it will prove a blessing if we can find an escape. Because on the other side isn't just the absence of suffering. It's a life more fulfilling than we imagined possible, richer and more meaningful than the safe existence we'd been clinging to. Andrew still has moments of anxiety. The old patterns still visit like familiar ghosts. But now he knows what they're telling him. Keep moving forward. Keep choosing life. Keep refusing to be a ghost in your own existence. Andrew stood at a crossroads one early morning, the city still quiet, the sun just beginning to paint the sky. Behind him lay the long road of who he'd been, every step traceable, every choice mapped, every failure catalogued in the museum of his memory. Ahead, stretched the road he hadn't yet walked, uncertain, but calling to him with a voice he'd been trying not to hear for years. It terrified him. But staying where he was terrified him more. Jung's message was simple, almost brutally so. Stop studying the road behind, turn around, and take one step forward. Just one, then another, then another. Not because you're ready, not because you know where it leads, but because the alternative is to remain frozen while life, indifferent to your fear, marches on without you. We must look ahead, not behind.